There's no genre of anime people love to hate as much as isekai. Ever since the modern isekai boom kicked off, these stories have been widely panned and derided, but they have also become extremely popular, with many franchises turning into absolute juggernauts. How did Isekai Slop, with its bad writing, somehow become the unstoppable force that took over all of anime? This can really seem like a contradiction. If so many people think these shows are repetitive, predictable, generic, and poorly written, then why do so many continue to watch them? Why do new isekai anime keep getting made every single season? And why do some of these supposedly generic series become huge hits with enormous fan bases? The truth is, audiences don't care if these shows share similar features, as long as they are entertaining overall. Viewers are perfectly willing to overlook derivative and repetitive elements if the story is fundamentally fun. Even if repetitive setups annoy people, like say getting run over by a truck, that's only a minor setup. Once it's over, audiences quickly move on to the parts of the story they actually enjoy, the elements that are compelling and different. And this is something that gets overlooked in a lot of criticism of the genre. People sometimes act as though having a familiar premise automatically makes a story bad, but there are countless genres where stories use the same basic setups over and over again. Most detective stories involve a mystery. Most romances involve people falling in love. Most action stories involve fighting. The existence of familiar conventions doesn't automatically make the individual story uninteresting. The same is true for isekai. A character getting transported to another world is not the entire story. It is usually just the premise that allows the actual story to begin. What matters is what the author does with the world, the characters, the conflicts, and the relationships after that. In fact, elements like training, strategies, intense planning, and constant fights are only a minor part of what makes these shows work. If we removed them from the best series, the remaining narrative would still stand on its own as an excellent story. Therefore, even if a show features an overpowered protagonist, it can still be great. A compelling narrative should have enough complex plotting, humor, and character relationships to be entertaining no matter how strong the main character personally is. This is why an overpowered main character doesn't automatically become a flaw. A character being extremely powerful only removes one possible source of conflict. It doesn't eliminate every other kind of conflict. A protagonist can still struggle with relationships, politics, morality, personal trauma, social expectations, or simply figuring out what they want to do with their life. They can be powerful enough to defeat almost anyone and still find themselves in situations where punching harder isn't a solution. And this brings us to a core appeal of these shows, to a lot of the audiences. Fantasy wish fulfillment. A story where the main character is powerful, successful, and gets to go on a fun, almost leisurely, vacation-like adventure is an ultimate comfort food to most people. It doesn't matter if every single second isn't high-stakes action or intense conflict. Audiences generally enjoy watching peaceful, daily life scenes for large stretches of time. They want to see funny character interactions and relaxed slice-of-life moments. Sometimes the protagonist doesn't necessarily have to constantly struggle just to survive. Once they become powerful, the story can spend time showing what their life is actually like, and that can be incredibly satisfying. There is something inherently appealing about seeing an ordinary person suddenly gain the freedom, resources, and abilities that they never had before. Maybe they can build a house, start a business, explore a fantasy city, become friends with unusual people, or simply travel around and experience a world that is completely different from their old one. For many viewers, that is the point. They aren't watching because they need to constantly wonder whether the protagonist or supporting characters are going to survive the next 5 minutes. They are watching because they want to spend time in this world with these characters. The same logic applies to harem elements. Many of these series feature multiple girls falling in love with a main character for varying reasons. While these romantic relationships often aren't exactly the most deeply developed writing in anime history, fans don't really care. They enjoy seeing cute, conventionally attractive characters on screen and experiencing sweet, comforting romantic interactions, even if they may sometimes appear somewhat unprompted. And again, this is fantasy wish fulfillment. The appeal is often emotional and escapist rather than realistic. At the end of the day, many people who watch these shows like fantasy wish fulfillment. It is exactly why harem, reverse harem, and overpowered isekai remain an unstoppable force in the anime industry. And there is nothing particularly strange about this. Entertainment has always provided audiences with fantasies they would never experience in normal life. Superhero stories let ordinary people imagine being incredibly powerful. Sports stories let people imagine being elite athletes. Isekai takes that concept and makes the fantasy much more literal. You get transported into another world where an entirely new life is waiting for you. The genre as a whole also gets criticism that's completely unfounded. For example, isekai protagonists are not at all blank self-insert characters. Most isekai protagonists have very different, distinct, and complex personalities. Like Subaru and Kazuma, they don't all behave the same way, and they don't all want the same things. Some are selfish, some are kind, some are cowardly, some are arrogant, some are deeply traumatized, some are incredibly competent, while others are complete disasters. The idea that every isekai protagonist is just an empty vessel for the viewer simply doesn't really hold up when you look at the genre as a whole. A character like Subaru is defined by his flaws, insecurities, and emotional problems. Kazuma is deliberately written as selfish, sarcastic, and often deeply irresponsible person. These characters can be frustratingly funny, sympathetic, or even unlikable at times, but they certainly aren't personality-free. And the isekai worlds are not all the same as each other either. The stories feature complex and detailed world building, and the worlds are unique and support very complex and very different plots. One series can focus on politics and economics, and another can focus on survival. Another can focus on magic systems, another can focus on warfare. Another can be mostly comedy, and another can be a slow slice-of-life adventure. Just because they share a broad premise doesn't mean they function the same way as other stories. In fact, the flexibility of the isekai premise is one of the reasons it has become so successful. By transporting a character into another world, the author has an excuse to create an entirely new setting with its own rules, cultures, conflicts, and history. The protagonist doesn't necessarily have to know anything about the world when they arrive. The audience can learn about it alongside them, and because the character comes from a different world, the author can naturally create situations where they compare their old life with their new one. That can lead to comedy, drama, world building, or even social commentary. And those stories don't have simple one-dimensional side characters. The side characters' personalities are complex and well-developed, and the side characters can play important roles and compelling roles in the stories. Obviously, not every isekai series handles its supporting cast equally well. There is plenty of disposable writing in the genre, just like there is in every other major genre, but that doesn't mean the criticism applies to the entire subgenre. There are isekai series with incredibly memorable supporting casts, and sometimes those supporting characters are arguably more important than the protagonist. So that's criticism of the subgenre as a whole that's generally unwarranted mostly. But that doesn't explain why the genre has become so successful. People aren't necessarily watching because they think every isekai is the single best written story ever. They're watching because the formula works. The premise is easy to understand, the fantasy is immediately appealing, the worlds can be explored almost indefinitely, the characters can be placed into completely new situations, the protagonist can grow in power or influence, and the story can switch between action, comedy, romance, adventure, and slice of life whenever it wants. That flexibility is incredibly valuable. And, perhaps most importantly, isekai gives viewers something that a lot of other genres don't provide as consistently: the feeling that they are escaping into another life. One person can complain about the cliches and repetitive conventions. They can complain about the repetitive titles, the trucks, the generic fantasy kingdoms, the overpowered protagonists, and the endless harems. But as long as audiences keep finding these stories entertaining, the genre isn't going away. The real reason isekai has become so dominant isn't because viewers suddenly stop caring about writing, it's because viewers care about being entertained, and there are a lot of different ways to accomplish that. A series doesn't have to reinvent storytelling to be successful. It doesn't have to have the most complicated plot or the deepest characters ever written. Sometimes it just needs to create a world that people enjoy spending time in. And isekai has become incredibly good at doing exactly that. That is why the genre can simultaneously be one of the most mocked genres in anime and one of the most successful. People love to call it slop, but apparently many other audiences really like consuming it. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more anime analysis videos like this, and if you liked it, share it on social media.